The honorable boot of Camp Henderson. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the horizon of Camp Henderson, casting long and amber shadows across the meticulously manicured grounds of the United States Marine Corps base. It was a day that felt like any other, yet there was a peculiar energy in the air, a mixture of disciplined routine and the subtle, unspoken camaraderie that defined the lives of the men stationed there. Among them was Private Gomer Pyle, a man whose heart was as large as his stature and whose innocence often acted as a gentle mirror to the rigid world around him. Gomer was a soul of pure intentions, possessing a smile that could brighten the dimmest barracks and a sense of wonder that remained untouched by the complexities of military life. Walking alongside him was Sergeant Vince Carter, a man of grit, experience, and a vocal cord that had been tempered by years of shouting orders. Sergeant Carter was the quintessential Marine, a man who breathed discipline and lived by the manual. However, on this particular afternoon, there was something noticeably different about the way the sergeant was moving. Instead of his usual brisk and authoritative stride, he was executing a rhythmic, heavy thud with every second step. Gomer Pyle, ever observant and genuinely concerned for his superior, slowed his pace to match the sergeant. He tilted his head, his eyes widening with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. He looked down at the ground and then back up at the sergeant's face, which was twisted in a grimace of focused discomfort. Gomer spoke first, his voice carrying that familiar, warm southern lilt. He asked what had happened to the foot of Sergeant Vince Carter. The sergeant stopped in his tracks, leaning slightly to one side to balance himself. He looked at Gomer, then down at his own right leg, where a massive, gray, metallic object was firmly attached. It was not a boot in the traditional sense, but a heavy lead mold, a piece of industrial equipment that looked entirely out of place on a human limb. Sergeant Carter sighed, a sound of profound frustration. He asked if Gomer meant this specific foot. Gomer nodded vigorously, affirming that he did indeed mean that foot. He expressed a sincere desire to know what had occurred. The sergeant explained that a large thing had landed on it. Gomer was taken aback, exclaiming that he was not kidding and asking what the object was. Sergeant Carter, with a dry tone that suggested he had already replayed the event in his mind 100 times, described it as a big lead thing. He emphasized that it was a big lead thing that had landed with a boom right on his foot. Gomer gasped, stating that he would be darned. He then inquired how long the sergeant would have to wear such a cumbersome thing. Sergeant Carter replied that the sergeant in charge of the shop was on his way to get the situation taken care of right at that moment. Gomer looked concerned, pointing out that the hospital was a long way away. He wondered aloud why they had not driven a vehicle. This prompted a moment of realization for the sergeant, who repeated the question to himself, wondering why they had not driven. He then quickly recovered his composure, claiming that they were exercising. He stated that the doctor had instructed him to exercise the foot so it would not get stiff. As they continued their slow journey, Gomer noticed that Sergeant Carter was drifting toward the wrong side of the path. He called out, asking where the sergeant was going, noting that the hospital was in the opposite direction. Sergeant Carter stopped, looked around, and admitted that Gomer was right. He admitted he had forgotten, asking if Gomer could imagine such a thing. When they finally arrived at the maintenance area where they hoped to find relief, they were met by a young Marine who checked his watch. He informed them that it was 16:45 and the personnel were gone. Sergeant Carter was incredulous. He demanded to know what the Marine meant by gone and why they would leave so early. He questioned what would happen if there was an emergency. The young Marine, with a touch of practical logic, asked what kind of emergency one could possibly have in a metal shop. Sergeant Carter gestured emphatically to his foot, declaring that this was the emergency. Gomer, ever the problem solver, suggested that perhaps they could borrow a little saw from the hobby shop. This suggestion was met with immediate dismissal. Sergeant Carter told Guile to forget it, stating that he was not about to let two dummies close to him with anything sharp. He ordered them to move on. Despite the setback, Gomer remained optimistic. He told the sergeant not to worry, mentioning that the Science Metal Shop had said they would be open at 7:30 in the morning. Sergeant Carter was not comforted. He pointed out that the ceremony was at noon the next day. He expressed his anxiety over how long it would take to get the lead piece off and get everything welded back together. He groaned as he moved, mentioning how sore the foot felt. Gomer observed that all the pulling and tugging had made the foot quite swollen inside the lead. He suggested that it would feel a lot better in the morning after the swelling went down. Sergeant Carter snapped back, calling Gomer an idiot and stating that he was not going to bed with a thing on his foot. He insisted they had to get it off that night. Gomer noted that as long as the foot was swollen, it would not come off. This led Sergeant Carter to a realization. He asked what one does when they sprain an ankle. Gomer replied that you put ice on it to take the swelling down. Sergeant Carter realized they could not put ice directly on the foot because it was encased in metal. Instead, he proposed a different solution. They would cool his entire body down to reduce the swelling. He decided they would go to the coldest place he knew, the freezer in the mess hall. 20 minutes later, Gomer and another Marine named Jackson stood outside the heavy door of the mess hall freezer. Gomer remarked that the sergeant had been in there for about 20 minutes and should be about done. They decided to check on him. Gomer called out to Sergeant Carter, asking if he was all right. Jackson pointed out that the sergeant probably could not hear because of the earmuffs he was wearing. Gomer tried again, shouting to ask if the boot felt like it was loosening up. From inside the frosty air, Sergeant Carter's voice came back, shivering but hopeful. He thought he felt it slip a little bit. He asked to be left alone for a few more minutes, confident it would come right off. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Gomer's heart sank. He asked who was there. It was Sergeant Hacker. The panic was immediate. Gomer whispered to Jackson that they had to get out of there. He told Jackson to open the back door while he grabbed the sergeant. He hissed into the freezer, telling Sergeant Carter to hurry because Sergeant Hacker was coming. The escape was frantic. Sergeant Carter scrambled out, still wearing the lead boot, and they slipped through the back door slot just as Hacker entered. Hacker looked around the empty mess hall, suspicious. He called out, asking if that was Jackson back there. Inside their hiding spot, Sergeant Carter was distraught. He lamented that they were trapped and that he could not let Hacker see him with the boot on. He instructed Gomer and Jackson to tell Hacker they had stopped for a snack if they were caught. Hacker opened the freezer and found it empty, but his eyes were sharp. He spotted Slater and Pyle. He demanded to know what the two of them were doing there at such an hour. Gomer, trying to sound natural, explained that they were hungry and had decided to have a little midnight snack. Hacker was not impressed. He reminded them that this was a Marine Corps mess hall, not their mother's kitchen. He told them that if they wanted a snack, they would have it with 200 other guys at breakfast. He ordered them to get out before he had them thrown in the brig. Once they were safely away, Sergeant Carter realized he had left the lead boot in the freezer. He asked where it was, and Gomer explained it was still inside. Sergeant Carter was frustrated, asking if Gomer expected him to carry it out in front of Hacker. He ordered Gomer to go back and get the boot. Gomer was hesitant, reminding the sergeant that Hacker had just threatened them with the brig. But the sergeant was firm. Gomer returned to the mess hall and found Sergeant Hacker. He sheepishly explained that he had come back to get the boot. Hacker, holding the heavy object, asked what the battalion booby boot was doing in his freezer in the middle of the night. Gomer, unable to tell a lie, explained that Sergeant Carter had left it there. Hacker pressed further, wanting to know what Carter was doing with it. He threatened Gomer with trespassing charges if he did not give it to him straight. Gomer confessed that Sergeant Carter was wearing it. He explained that he had accidentally put his own foot in it first, and they had a difficult time getting it off. Then Sergeant Carter got curious and wondered if he could do the same. Hacker laughed, finding the story hard to believe. Gomer insisted that there was just something about a big old empty boot that made people curious. Hacker refused to give the boot back to Gomer. He stated he would give it to the colonel, who would then return it to Sergeant Carter. He planned to tell the colonel exactly what Gomer had said. When Gomer returned empty-handed, Sergeant Carter was livid. He learned that Hacker had the boot and intended to tell the colonel. Sergeant Carter realized he would have to go and beg Hacker for the boot to save his reputation. He warned Gomer that this time he was not going to put a foot in the boot, but he might stuff all of Gomer into it. Sergeant Carter found Hacker and tried to appeal to their long history. He admitted they had differences but asked for grace, calling himself a victim of circumstances. He offered Hacker anything in exchange for the boot and silence. Hacker agreed to the deal, under the condition that neither of them would ever speak of the incident. Carter was relieved and thanked him. He then asked for help getting his own foot out, as he had managed to get stuck as well while trying to prove how easy it should have been. Later, as the group gathered near the freezer again, they were interrupted by Lieutenant Anderson. The lieutenant asked what they were doing there so late. At that moment, Sergeant Hacker emerged from the freezer, shivering, and admitted he had his foot caught in the boot. He explained he was trying to get it off. Lieutenant Anderson smiled. He thanked the sergeants, much to their confusion. He explained that at the staff meeting that afternoon, they could not decide whether Sergeant Carter's platoon or Sergeant Hacker's platoon should receive the Excellence Award. He remarked that Hacker had just broken the tie. As he turned to leave, he asked why they thought sitting in a freezer would help. Gomer, ever helpful, explained that it worked for Sergeant Carter just a while ago. Lieutenant Anderson paused, looked at Carter, and asked Gomer to tell him more. He concluded that perhaps the competition for the award was tied up once again. The night ended not with a reprimand, but with the warm glow of shared humanity. In the end, the heavy lead boot was not a burden of shame, but a symbol of the unexpected bonds formed in the most ridiculous of circumstances. Sergeant Carter and Sergeant Hacker, though rivals, found themselves sharing a common, chilly experience that leveled the playing field. And Gomer Pyle, with his honest heart, reminded everyone that even in the rigid world of the Marines, there was always room for a little curiosity, a lot of laughter, and the kind of friendship that could survive even the coldest freezer. The morning sun would soon rise, bringing with it the ceremony and the promise of a new day, but the story of the lead boot would be whispered with a smile for many years to come at Camp Henderson.